Peterborough. I met fans who came on a train from Preston and Manchester and Birmingham. I met several fans who've driven from London, one of which drove overnight, hasn't been to bed yet, which I'm not sure how safe that is if he's planning to drive back tonight. Fans who've flown from Dublin in Ireland, from Malta in Europe, from Belgium, and one. He wasn't lying to me because I asked him 3 times, then I asked him for evidence of the airplane ticket, who flew from Calgary. Somebody flew from Calgary to be here, and he's here for all 3 of the remaining ODIs, so he's here for a full week. Yeah, the passion, the joy and the love of cricket and the pride of, I think it's something that only those who've ever emigrated can understand. The pride of being from the part of the world you're from and representing your nation in another part of the world is so apparent to see and lovely to hear those stories. The one that got me from the World Cup this day last year was the fan that I met, and then I went up to the commentary box to tell Ian Bishop about it, who had sold his car in Australia, in Melbourne, to be there. He said, well, we might not go to another World Cup for another decade, so I'm not missing out on it. I've got a friend in Texas, I'll sleep on his couch. I don't have the money for the ticket, but I'll sell my...
लाइभ थोरै स्लो छ है आईसीसीटीमा चाहिँ फुल लाइभ छ गएर हेर्न सक्नुहुन्छ है आईसीसी
That's an incredible story. I actually remembered reading about that. I think that might have made it into the press as well.
It was quite funny actually. I went up to the commentary box at the end of the 9th, 40 for 1. The television commentary box, that is, in that fantastic Major League stadium. And Bish was off air at the time, and I've been lucky enough to broadcast and work a little bit with Bish. And for all of us in the industry, we all look up to him, kind of Uncle Bish, he's affectionately referred to as by many. And he was saying, Lenny, you always told me Nepal was special, but I never expected it to be quite like this in Texas of all places. And actually there's a massive Nepalese community in and around Dallas in particular, and that's why many would have, not travelled far to be there. But there was, I think that day when I went around the crowd, I counted over 40 states within America that fans had come from, Nepal fans that is. There was a hardcore of about 100 Dutch fans as well, can't rule them out either. But it was that story that, as I went around the crowd, ended up randomly with some American police with me for a bit of it because they were getting scared by the number of photo requests. Bizarre, totally bizarre. But the fan that I spoke to who'd come from Australia, I said, Bish, I've got a great story for you. And he was spellbound. It almost took his breath away when I told him. He said, do you mind if I tell that on air? And I said, mate, I don't mind if you tell it on air. I'd love if you tell it on air because it helps get across the scale of what we're talking about in terms of love of cricket, and he did it infinitely better than I ever would have. And so well that it did indeed get picked up by many quarters of the press. And that day was particularly intoxicating. It was, I'm pretty sure, a midweek game with, I think it might have been an 11 a.m. local time start, maybe a 10 a.m. local time start, but there was a cataclysmic thunderstorm that threatened the whole match and ended up with delaying the start by about an hour. And all that meant was there was an extra hour for the Nepal fans to get stuck into the beverages and make it even more of a party affair. I believe they sold out of all concession stalls on the day. It was 7,200, I think, is the capacity of the MLC Stadium in Grand Prairie. It felt a bit more like 30 or 40,000 there that day. Good diving stop and cover point by Lion Cachet as he wrings his hand out with the pain from the cold. But that's what World Cups for me should be all about, Mel.
Yeah.
The story of the Ugandan fans who travelled to Guyana. We saw Papua New Guinea very nearly beat the West Indies on home soil, push them right to the brink. We saw Canada beating Ireland. We saw USA beating Pakistan. That 20-team World Cup was a kind of great step into the unknown, wasn't it? And I think it's here to stay.
I certainly hope so. It felt for me like the first real World Cup, probably since 2015, the ODI World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. Just to have the variety of fans, the colour. Sometimes you find, I've even found that with Zimbabwe in Australia for the 2022 World Cup, which wasn't as big, but Zimbabwe was there. They got my vote for the fans of that tournament. They were incredible, and you spoke to some of those fans in Australia there from Zimbabwe, and they weren't even cricket fans. The opportunity to support Zimbabwe was what had drawn them along, and I think, you know, there were some of them who became cricket fans during that World Cup because of it.
It's surely what we want, isn't it?
It
Welcome
sure
more
is.
people into our game. Again, the gusts really breezing around us. Yeah, there was certainly good performances by the associates. Canada's win over Ireland was a very fine one. USA beating Pakistan via that drama, the super over. But there could have been so many more big upsets, couldn't there? Scotland were all over England like a hot rash.
Oh, they were
Barbados.
well all over them, but that rain got called off. But Scotland gave Australia a very good game in St Lucia as well.
I describe it as more than that. A true blue Aussie fan for the first time.
I thought it was just at the end.
They had them on the rack. The absolute rack.
Just at the end.
Stoinis played a once-in-a-lifetime innings. It was almost Maxwell-esque. He made 59 off 29. Yeah, they were right up against it. Glenn Maxwell dismissed in the 9th over. They needed over 2 a ball at one stage.
Yeah, it was just that annoying Australian ability to find someone to produce that kind of innings. But Brandon McMullen, he was brilliant that day. They followed up. They had a fantastic win against Namibia, Scotland. They put them within touching distance of the Super 8s. Gosh, if they'd managed to get over the line against Australia, that would have really turned things on its head.
Typically, as we often see it, you think back to that 2015 World Cup, quite often the associate game
Yes, are the closest
are
ones.
the best games
Yes.
in the tournament. So
Ah,
you think about Scotland, Afghanistan, down in Dunedin in 2015.
Puri
Shapoor
Amin
Zadran, who
Audito.
could barely hold a bat, hitting, who was he with? Samuel Shinwari, wasn't it? Sprawling out across the turf as robbed Scotland of what would have been their first ever World Cup win. Papua New Guinea, Uganda last year. The Super Over, you were probably there, were you, for, was that Oman, Namibia, wasn't it, in Bridgetown and Barbados, as Namibia somehow came back.
that was the first game there. I was there. It's ridiculous. Well, this has always been my argument when people argue against associates being in it. And I really dislike the term minnows. I really don't like that term.
Nicely bowled by Van Meekeren, beats the outside edge. It's a question I've been asked in several different podcasts, media appearances I've done, stuff like that. Why do you call it associate cricket at all? And I think it's a good question. I'm not in any way disparaging the question. I think if you don't call it associate cricket, it doesn't give you something to categorise it as. It doesn't give you something to explain the struggle and the endeavour that the men and the women, boys and girls in these countries have to go through to try and reach parity on the world stage. For an associate team, any associate team to qualify for any World Cup is a major achievement. Even the 20-team World Cup, Zimbabwe missed out in the last qualifier.
Yeah.
They just beaten Pakistan in Perth in the previous World Cup in front of all those fans you're talking about. So, for an associate team to get to a World Cup is a massive achievement. I think there's a brand of associate cricket. I don't think if we brought Steve Smith and Glenn Maxwell here today to Dundee, they'd particularly fancy it. It's tough. You play in different conditions. You can play in very adverse ones like we are today. And every match is cutthroat. Every match is meaning. Every match is context. That's why it's so enthralling. That's why it's so engaging. So that's what associate cricket is. It's whipped away in front to square. Should be at least a couple. He's going to get to the rope. Tejan Idamanuru can only escort it there.
अबको 5 मिनटपछि लाइभ बन्द हुँदैछ है गाइज म लाइभ बन्द गरिदिन्छु तपाईँहरूले चाहिँ क्रोममा गएर आइसिसी टिभी सर्च गर्नु होला यसमा साइन गर्नुमा साइन गरेर हेर्न सक्नुहुन्छ
The number of teams. So, pulled away nicely. It won't get to the rope this time. At 2 though. The fact that you went back to that last World Cup that had a decent number of teams in Australia and New Zealand and went through the different results. And the matches that involved at least one associate side were the more exciting, closer matches. And there were some massive blowouts that involved 2 of the full member nations, really one-sided matches. So when people say, well, it'll make for, they'll just get smashed or it won't be very exciting, it'll be too one-sided, I just don't think that argument holds water. It can happen to any side.
And in reality, there is the occasional blowout.
Yeah, but there is between 2 full member nations as well.
Absolutely. And, a performance like Oman's that day against England was a bit of a calamity in front of a baying English press pack. In Antigua, bowled it out for 47. That was an Oman team in transition, the end of one era, going into the next. But what people don't remember is that a week prior in Bridgetown, they restricted Australia to 160 on a good surface. In fact, at one stage it looked like they'd restrict them to about 120 or 130, but again it was a fantastic comeback from Marcus Stoinis, who made 67 off 36, but he was dropped. They were in big trouble in that game, really were. Aki Bilias took one of the greatest catches in World Cup history off Mehran Khan, sprawling at extra cover. Very reminiscent of the Zishan Maqsood one of Paul Sterling in the T20 World Cup in Dharamshala in 2016. So,
टिम कस्तो छ होला नेपाल र जस्तो जति त अहिलेसम्म नेपालले चाहिँ 95% गइरहेको छ
core and the media coverage and the punditry around cricket is driven by the full member nations. There's some notable exceptions. In the UAE, there's an active press corps. Paul Randy does an amazing job at the national. Curtis de Jong in the Netherlands. We see Binod Pandey here, Subhash and all the guys back in Nepal. Patrick McGinney, there's good coverage of the game. In Uganda too. But the reality is the vast majority of the coverage of world cricket is from the full member nations. And they actually don't. They only care when an associate wins. So if they push them all the way to the brink, like Nepal did against South Africa, it's a footnote for half a day. But if South Africa had lost that game,
Yeah.
it's a huge story. And that's the heartbreak of it. Now, the brilliance of it is that 3 in every 4 years in the men's game and the women's game, we get 2 T20 World Cups and 1 World Cup. And with the expansion of the women's game, we're now going to see a position whereby there'll be guaranteed associate spots in almost all the World Cups, not the women's ODI World Cup, but the other 3 events, yes. So we should see at least some associate presence at 3 of the 4 major World Cups, and in the men's and women's games, they're 3 of 4 years. So those chances that felt so infrequent in the previous right cycle.
Subscriber 100 counted, guys. Thank you for watching or subscribing.
Decision that was immediately reversed after just one edition. We dropped down to a 10-team 50 over World Cup in the men's format as the 50 comes up here. Those days are in the past, and the associates, thanks to primarily to the ICC pathways, have more games and opportunities to improve than ever. They're still doing it on threadbare budgets, yes. They still get a real fraction of the full member funding. But at least they're getting more playing opportunities to develop and get better. When you play more cricket, you get better. It's pretty simple. So, I think we saw 3 associate wins, didn't we? Over full members, the last World Cup in the USA and the Caribbean. If the associates can adjust to the conditions in India and Sri Lanka, I think we'll definitely see more in that next World Cup.
Yeah.
And remember, we could see 9 associates there again. Namibia and Uganda, they'll be the incumbents down in that Africa qualifier. Zimbabwe will have to play well to qualify, even though they've home advantage.
I think that's certainly almost more than a possibility, almost a probability. And you have to remember too, I think part of it comes because they play all of their cricket in precious situations. Tournament play is so different to bilateral play, and these associate players come into all of those tournaments kind of battle-hardened when it comes to tournament play. And I think that does make a pretty huge difference. One thing I think I would like to say, I
नेपालको दोस्रो गेम चाहिँ जनवरी 8 मा रहेको छ है, सन्डे.
So by that, I look at someone like Scotland women, who were in Pakistan for those World Cup qualifiers, and they qualified for that qualifying tournament, whereas Zimbabwe didn't. And they also beat West Indies, the full member nation. They didn't end up qualifying. It's pulled hard. But there's Fielder in the right position. So yes, Scotland women, they qualified ahead of Zimbabwe, who didn't make it. They beat West Indies. They've moved up the rankings, but because they didn't qualify, they don't actually have any more fixtures scheduled for this year. So I would like to see a bit more reward for the teams that actually move up past the full member nations in the rankings. Incentive.
Piece of fielding that by Shariz Ahmed, the sub-fielder. Deep mid-wicket ends Michael Levitt's introduction to the attack. He's come in, his right arm medium pace, the Burley. He's going to be telling me now that he's an all-rounder, not an opening batter, the amount he's bowling of late. 12 have been bowled, 52 for 1 the score. Andrew Leonard here with Mel Farrell. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the development and the positive developments of the associate game and how it continues to gain following and support, and how the players, men and women, continue to, well, really push against the glass ceiling and push the performance levels through to new breakthroughs and to new heights. Get in touch, use that hashtag CWCL2. You can message me directly, Andrew Leonard at Cricket Badge on Twitter, Instagram, Mel Farrell. You can type in Melinda Farrell, she'll pop up. She's that popular on Twitter or Instagram. There's only one of you, Mel. Plenty of Andrew Leonards floating around the world, I'm sure. There's only one Mel Farrell.
Actually, there's another one who is, I believe, a Rockette. You know, the dancer in the New York Radio City Rockettes?
Oh, yeah. There was a Mel Farrell.
There is a Melinda Farrell. It's exactly my name.
Well, maybe there's only one Mel Farrell then.
That's
she was a Melinda. Sunshine has somehow returned, despite the skies not making it look likely. Very, very gratefully received, because it's adding just a degree or two of temperature. And it's helping keep Paulie van Meekeren's big long limbs moving. Bertel and Sharkey survived him for the moment, though, and start to grow in confidence. A nice on drive. Be cut off by Roelof van der Merwe, who's probably going to start loosening his shoulders quite shortly. Yeah, I think the reality is that for a number of reasons, next year's World Cup in February, with 20 teams, at least 8 associates in it, is going to be one to really look forward to. You would hope that the BCCI and Sri Lanka Cricket can get the venues announced nice and early so we can give fans lots of an opportunity to anticipate where they're going to travel to. I'd love to see the Indian fans kind of almost adopt an associate team each. I'd love to see that. I don't know how. I'm going to try and start that campaign myself somehow if I can. If Nepal qualify, you won't believe the number of Nepalese fans who will beg, steal or borrow away across the border. And again, you know, if you're putting together a schedule, if Delhi and Dharamshala are being used as venues, put Nepal's group up there, you'll have the best crowds of the whole tournament, barring the India games and the Sri Lanka games. For them, good hook shot. Gets a great piece of it and gets it to the rope again. Nida Minoru just escorts it. That's a fine stroke from Kushal Bertel.
Yeah, you feel like he's just started to warm up. Loss of the early wicket, it kept him pretty quiet. But here, he just rode that bounce really well, picked it up. Short ball from Van Meekeren, just probably with a little bit too much width.
Yeah, I would suspect that Kushal Patel has really enjoyed this move back up to the top of the order. Didn't quite understand what was going on in Canada. He had a little bit of a dry run up at the top of the order, but he'd been bowling so well they wanted to keep him in the team, so they dropped him down to 5 and 6. He's just the kind of player who has to open the batting for me. And thought he played really well the other day. Again, we're seeing a bright start despite the loss of Asif Sheikh. Nepal are in full control. Not quite sure where outside of Van Meekeren, where the threat comes from. Kyle Klein bowled brilliant comeback spells.
यो भर्खरै बात दिएपछि लाइन लाएर निस्किहाल्छ नि बात दिएपछि ढोका खोलिदिनु खोलिदियो भने चाहिँ बाहिर नै हालिदिन्छ कहाँ बाहिर बाहिर छैन बरु यहीँ र त्यही ढोका पिछाउँ बाल्दा हुन्छ कि अनि ढोका खोलिदिनुपर्छ एकछिन सुसु भएपछि Like that.